Hello, welcome back. In this episode we're going to be creating a class to represent a single block within a chunk of our game. Now back in December I made this episode where I briefly explained how the blocks are going to be stored. And in the episode what I said is that chunks are going to be storing a vector of unsigned 8-bit integers. And the reason for this was pretty simple, it's because it would save a lot of memory. However, we're not exactly going to be doing that, but rather we're going to be creating a class, as I mentioned at the start of this episode. And the reason for this is pretty simple. We can still have just one byte per block, and we can also have the added convenience of a class through the use of functions and constructors and other things as well. So to start off with, I created a new chunk folder in the world folder, and in this folder I've added two files, chunkblock.cpp and chunkblock.h. And both of these files have a new namespace called chunk. So before continuing, let's just quickly add these new files and the namespace chunk for both of them. So the first thing I'm going to do in chunkblock.h is create the class for the blocks, and this is just going to be called class block, and it's going to be inside of the chunk namespace. Actually, now that I think about it, the block class isn't actually going to have any private members, so there's no point having it as a class. We're just going to be storing it as a struct instead, which has all of its members, functions and constructors public by default. So as I said earlier, this struct is going to be 1 byte in size, and that is because it's going to be storing only one data member really for now, and that is a uint80, and this is just going to be called ID, which stores the block ID. And the block ID of the chunk block is going to be respective to the block ID enum that we created. So for example, if this is going to be 0, then this is going to be an air block, because in the enum class, air has the ID of 0. Similarly, if it's equal to 1, then it's going to be a grass block. So for now, we're going to leave the ID like this. We're going to default our block to be a grass block, and we can do that simply by putting equals 1. However, uint80 won't actually compile. It will complain saying that uint80 does not actually name a type, and that is because it's a type def, I believe, which is actually defined in a header file, cstdint. So just include cstdint at the top of the file, and then it should compile just fine. So now what we're going to do is basically have some convenience functions and constructors to our struct. The first constructor of this class is just going to be a default one, which means if we create this block with no arguments, then it's going to be defaulted to this basically. So this class is actually going to have a few more constructors. The first constructor is going to be taking in a block ID, the block ID enum. And I just came to a stupid realization. So if we include that header file quickly for the block ID, which is include blockid.h, and we try to compile, it probably won't. And this is because, of course, we have the class with the same name as the namespace, which you can't do. So to fix this, we're just going to rename this class to cblock, and then it should compile just fine. Anyways, the third constructor is just going to be taking in an unsigned 8-bit integer, so that is uint80 ID. So anyways, what these constructors are basically going to be doing is just giving, this number a number. So in the .cpp file, we're now going to implement the functions. So to do this, I'm just going to right-click, insert. So anyways, cool, we now have both of the constructors ready to be implemented. And both of these constructors are basically going to be doing the same thing, they're just going to be setting this ID here. So both of these are going to be doing this in the initializer list. So to do this, in the first one that takes in the block ID enum, we're just going to be saying ID to ID. However, in C++ we cannot actually implicitly convert an enum class to an integer. So we have to do this explicitly through the use of a static cast. So a static cast uint80, and then just wrap the ID passed in brackets, and that will explicitly convert the enum class to a uint80. And the bottom one is a lot more straightforward, so we're just going to basically be initializing ID to the one passed in. And that's it for both of the constructors, very simple. So we now have a very convenient struct which represents a single block within a chunk. However, it's not convenient enough just yet. So now what we're going to be doing is creating a few functions which can conveniently return the relevant data from the block database based on the block ID stored by the C block. See, the only way we have to actually get data for the blocks is to say block database get block id.get data, which is pretty horrible. Instead, we could do this a lot more nicely through the use of member functions on our new block struct. While making that little segment, I came to a little realization. You see, the block database returns a block type, and this is what the block type looks like. It stores the block data, which we're going to be needing, but unfortunately we have no way to actually get the data from the type class because that's stored privately. So we're just going to add another function to the block type class, which is going to be returning a constant reference to its data. And this function is just going to be called getData, and it's going to be a constant function because it's not going to be changing the class itself. And in the implementation of this function, it's pretty obvious what it's going to be doing. It's literally just going to be returning mdata. Alright, great. Okay, so now that we have that function, we can finally implement the functions that we wanted to in the chunk block class. So the first function is going to be returning a constant reference to some block data, and it's going to be called getData. And it's going to be a const function as well. And we're going to add one more function, and this function is going to be returning the block type class. So let's just say block type getType, and it's a const function as well. And these both return const references to the relevant type, and they're both const functions. So of course, because we need those types, we're just going to be including the header files. So the first header file is block data, and the second header file is block type. There we go. So in the implementation file, we're now going to be implementing both of those functions. But before we can do that, we just need to include the block database header, which is include block database, because these functions are basically going to be calling the block database, so of course we need to include that. So first of all, let's implement the top function getData. So this is just block database get id, and then getData. So now this function is out of the way, let's implement this second function here, which rather than returning the data, is just returning the type, which is returned by this one here. So if we compile, that should work fine. And what's this? We don't actually return the data, so of course don't forget to put return in front of it. I don't know why I forgot that. That's ridiculous. So anyway, now that that's out of the way, we now have very convenient ways to get the block data and the block type from the chunk, rather than doing the horrible thing that is using the block database. So anyway, that's it for this episode. We now have implemented the class, which is going to be stored by our chunks. So yeah, thank you for watching, and just before I finish this episode, I would like to say thank you to my first Patreon supporter. So thank you to Giacomo Pertin for being my first Patreon supporter. So anyways, once again, thank you for watching, and goodbye.